Hi, I'm Patric Palm, CEO and founder of Favro, and this is the Learn from Leaders podcast. The background to these interviews is that Favro clients are some of the most innovative and agile businesses out there. And it's used for collaborative planning by marketing teams, by product teams, HR, management teams. And what this means is that we get to know some truly inspiring people. So what we do in this podcast is that I invite them here for a conversation about something where they are true leaders, so we can all learn from it. Let's go.
Super welcome to the webinar here, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I like it. It's a little bit of a reunion because I've known you guys for so long, and without kind of E3 and GDC this year, a lot of those kind of coffee shop run-ins or whatever haven't been happening. So it's been a great opportunity to kind of connect with you guys and hear what's going on. And so yeah, I'm happy to be around.
Yeah, that is very true. And for the ones that aren't familiar with you, maybe a good start here would be if you could just kind of give us the whole backstory to how did you get into the industry and to the point where you're today.
Yeah. I mean, John kind of hit the high points, but in a previous life, I got into games through audio. So I was an audio post engineer. The first half of my career, my background is music. I did sound design and mixing and composition for radio and television. And after doing that for about 7 or 8 years, I really started yearning for something that was more creative. A lot of TV spot work and that kind of stuff is very short term. You're banging out, commercials every 2 or 3 days. And I was looking at my options, and on one side you've got film, right, which is long format entertainment, and then there was video games, and there was a push in the early 2000s towards better audio in games. It was like kind of a mini revolution. At least it got a lot of notice within the audio field. Like people that were doing audio professionally in other parts of entertainment really started noticing games. And I had been a gamer since I was a kid. And serendipitously, as I'm kind of going through that exploration in my head, the studio Ironlore had reached out and they were working on a demo to try and pitch their first game, which was like a Diablo-esque sort of game. And I did some demo work for them and then basically spent the next 3 years hoping that they would get a full game contract and take me on. And that eventually, and so I joined them in 2004, and that was sort of my first foray into video games. And I worked for about 1.5 years with them doing audio, and the studio was growing pretty rapidly. The project had gotten signed. And I just tended to be a super organized person by nature, and having done so much television and film work where you're constantly being thrown into really unique situations, having to adapt, having to plan, and still maintain a lot of creativity, they sort of asked if I would produce the game. Of course, I had no idea what that meant, but I'd done the audio thing for a long time, for almost 7 or 8 years, 10 years at that point. And so I said, sure, I'll give this a shot. And I kind of fell in love with it. And so really from that point forward, I shifted more towards a production track, and then eventually kind of more running development. So I worked at Ironlore for 3 or 4 years, and they eventually, unfortunately, shut down. And had friends that had started up at Harmonix, and that was a great intersection of my audio background and obviously my gaming background. And so I started there as a producer. Within a few years, I was running the production department, and then 6 or 7 years ago, actually joined the exec team, kind of overseeing development for the whole studio. I was there for 13 years, which was an amazing experience. I got to live through the sort of birth of the boom of the music game genre that went from being almost completely unknown to being a top 3 revenue generating genre in the industry in the late 2000s. And then, after 13 years making music games, just really was getting hungry to work on new kinds of games and work with new teams. And I had been friends with the folks at Unknown Worlds for a long time. In fact, one of the co-founders, Max, and I worked together at Ironlore way back in the day. And so as I was sort of looking around for what was next, he and I happened to bump into each other, and we started talking. And so that led to me joining the team back in March, which was an interesting time to change jobs as COVID was kind of setting in globally. So I've been with them for the last 6 months. And it's been great. They're a super, super unique team to work for.
Awesome. And when we've been having these interviews earlier this summer, we kind of have been talking about the fact that on one hand side the game industry today is bigger than the music and film industries combined, which is fantastic, and obviously playing games is something that makes a lot of sense when it's these COVID times. But what we have seen is that a huge difference between studios that were quite well prepared for this or quickly adapted, to working in a remote fashion, and there's been some studios that just, they haven't released anything because they get like shut down or not shut down, but they've really been struggling. So these kind of conversations we've been having this summer in this webinar has been around the transition to remote work, but that's not applicable in your case because it was like your studio was like born for this, because you did this from day one. So maybe we can rather go into what is the background to that the studio is set up in the way it is, and the thoughts around that, and of course if something actually changed with COVID after all.
Yeah, it was super a unique situation for me because Harmonix was a very brick and mortar studio, and as I think John mentioned, Unknown Worlds has been basically distributed since inception. A lot of the reason for that was that they started very small, working on a game called Natural Selection, which was sort of based on Natural Selection 2, which was based on the original Natural Selection, which was a Half-Life mod. So a lot of the original studio came together from a community of sort of mod game developers, and as the studio became viable as an entity, they hired on a lot of those folks, and that game community was an international community. And so they happened to have different developers that were working with them on a volunteer basis very, very early on that eventually became employees, and they were, very much distributed throughout the country. So as the studios continued to grow, they weren't tied necessarily to a specific location. They're headquartered technically in the Bay Area in San Francisco, but I think as I was mentioning yesterday when we caught up very briefly, we're right now distributed across 13 countries, 7 states in the US, and 7 time zones. So that's sort of been in their DNA from the very beginning. So it took zero effort to kind of readjust to COVID from a workflow standpoint. Obviously, the psychological aspect of all of it has been challenging, as it has been for every studio. But as far as the day-to-day way Unknown Worlds makes games, that's relatively been unchanged.
Yeah. So there's been a lot of webinars and similar online conversations, recently around, so how do we transition to this, not only ones that we have hosted, the investors are hosting and conferences that have now been going online, they tend to have a topic around this. And I find that one of the questions that seems toughest for people to have a solution to is the time zone difference. Yeah. And you mentioned that was really part of the DNA here from the beginning. Could you just go a little bit deeper on exactly, to handle the time zone thing? Because I think everyone's really wanting to hear a good answer to that.
Yeah, I guess just to sidebar for that super briefly, I was having this conversation, not specifically about time zones, although it's super related, with a colleague of mine at Harmonix. And he had this amazing analogy, which I think is super relevant here, is that when you're working with everybody in the same place, especially from a project leadership standpoint, he's sort of akin to hunting, right? You need a piece of information, you need something, the team is right there, you go to the team, you get what you need, basically, and you can move forward, and you can control that process because everybody is right there. And he said, when you start working distributed, it's a little more like fishing. You need things, and you throw your lines out, and you wait for someone to respond to your email to get back to your Slack, and you can't control that timeline as much. So what happens is you tend to have to spread out, and you start managing multiple threads. And what starts to happen is something that's sort of, I guess I would describe more as like asynchronous development, where everyone is making the same game together, but not always exactly the same time. And I think that really is the trick to think about when you're thinking about managing all this work. And I don't actually think it's as much as a tool and process thing as it is a culture thing within the studio. As I started spending more time at Unknown Worlds and getting to know the team, there were these very unique elements that I hadn't really seen anywhere else in terms of the high level of ownership in the games they were making and the way they were making those games across the entire studio. And everyone was sort of very versatile, very T-shaped in that way, because they got so used to needing to constantly be able to unblock themselves and move development forward, even if the person they're working closest with is 8 hours behind them or 6 hours in front of them. And I think that's led to a really unique culture where because of that high level of ownership and that high level of accountability, they're able to kind of make that work. Whereas I think studios coming into this for the first time that are used to hunting and not fishing need to learn those lessons and figure out how to not just change their tools and their process, but start adapting their culture to be more flexible in that way.
You said you said accountability and kind of owning it. I think that is very spot on. If we look at this from a leadership point of view, would you say that it also affects the way that you set goals? Because I guess if you have a culture where managers are very, very hands-on, I don't want to say micromanaging, but as close to that as you can get, it's going to be extremely hard. Well, basically in a asynchronous way of working, that just doesn't work. So you need to set goals that teams and people can autonomously deliver on.
Yeah, that goals is huge, and trust is another one, I think, and almost equally or sometimes more important. And that's something that I worry that a lot of people don't give enough thought to as they're kind of making these kind of transitions, is that because of the multiple time zones and because you're not there in the same building, and I think there's a little bit of a fallacy in that everyone believes, oh, if you're working there and your manager's right there, you know what's going on because they can walk by and they can see what's on your screen. And I think that provides a sort of false sense of security a lot of times. You don't know that person is necessarily working productively or whatever. But when you're in this remote situation, you don't have that false sense of security. You don't have that safety net. There's a lot of trust that the person out there in whatever part of the world they're doing their work is getting their work done, and that the people that are going to wake up in 4 hours and go to work have what they need there. And so I think that both being able to set and clearly talk about goals is important, and trusting that everyone is going to then take those tools and take those goals and be able to work together and move the product forward is equally as important.
So I'm gonna test the statement with you here now and see if you agree. So when we designed Favro and our kind of philosophies behind it is to enable autonomy and alignment. So obviously the whole kind of philosophy around if you want to call it OKRs or whatever, but really setting goals on a somewhat higher level, having teams autonomously working towards that, managing flow rather than tasks, visualizing that flow, so forth. All of these principles that are quintessentially agile principles. It's what we've built this tool upon. The statement I would like to try with you is that now in this situation, it is really kind of a shit hits the fan situation, because you might have leaders that talk about these values, but if you in practice have more of a traditional command and control culture in management, I guess that is going to be brutally clear now. How that falls apart versus if you're in a place where you might not even use those kind of words. You might just say, "Hey, we trust our team," and that's the fanciest word you put on it. You went into this period and it worked fine. Does this resonate with you, or do you think I got that wrong?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably right. I think in some ways this is where COVID may have helped the industry adapt, because everybody's going into this with a lot of empathy for what everybody's dealing with, right? So if it was more like a company decided we're going to make this change and the rest of the context wasn't there, they may not have been as flexible and as willing to adapt as they've needed to be, because they didn't really have a choice in this case, right? Everybody was more or less in the same boat in almost all the countries where everyone had to shift. And so I think because of that extra level of empathy that was out there and that extra level of, everyone needing to adapt, I think that really helped people maybe take more risk, maybe listen to more and look more carefully at what was going on and reevaluate their own process, as opposed to directly coming in and saying like, okay, this is the way we worked in the same building. Now we're going to basically figure out what version of this has to happen at home. But yeah, I think with that exception, I think I kind of agree with what you're saying, is that there has to be change on a lot of different fronts for that to work.
What you're saying is, tying well into, an old truth around, change management. It's extremely hard to change an organization if you're not in pain. It requires a crisis for you to actually, if you go to I don't know if you read the book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which is a fantastic read. And basically the whole book is about that, changing things when there's a crisis, that's actually not the hard thing. If you're trying to reinvent yourself when things are going well, that is ridiculously hard. And here are some tips for how you can do that. It's a fantastic read. So speaking about culture, you mentioned Harmonix being more of a kind of brick and mortar situation. And I remember when I visited there, there was my impression was that it was a very strong culture, but I would also guess that the culture is very much built in kind of a face-to-face situation over a long time. Now, with a studio like Unknown Worlds, where you have you're distributed from the beginning, how do you develop culture, and how do you think that maybe have affected what culture is for you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I had to coming into the role I was coming into, I had to sort of learn very quickly what was sort of in the special sauce, right? What allowed them to make a game like Subnautica? How did they make it? And I think what I really learned is that there were two things. The studio really develops openly with the public and has for a very long time, going all the way back to even when they were working on Natural Selection. They have always sort of done everything in kind of an open access format. They've always valued the community. They've always built the game with the community. And I guess to kind of put my plug in for Favro here, that's been a great tool for doing that, because we've been able to make boards public and be able to show parts of our backlog publicly and bugs publicly and kind of work and get that feedback. And that's been really helpful. So I think the desire to continue to develop with the people playing the games has been a huge thing. And because they've prioritized that, I think that's allowed them to develop their own sort of sets and rules and policy around what's important to them. And that's the thing that's important to them and has shaped the culture over the years. I think the other thing is just this idea that that everybody has so much impact on the game. Traditionally they have not been a studio that's used producers, and they don't have a lot of people in what I would call like a system designer role there. They have creative leads at the head of projects, they have level designers building levels, but they don't really have anyone there whose specific job is to design the game. That's kind of a shared responsibility, and I think that's where a lot of the ownership comes from. And I'm still learning a little bit about how that works there, but I would say that those two things are probably some of the things that have created the elements about what makes that opportunity or that culture so unique there, is that they don't have people in roles whose job it is to always make those decisions. And so a lot of that falls back to the team. I think they have valued that since they were very small at the beginning. And as they've grown and are continuing to grow, it is one of the things that everyone in the studio uniformly make sure that we maintain as we continue to evolve as a studio. And one of the first things I did when I joined was I interviewed everybody at the company. What's important about this place? What do we have to make sure we preserve? And unanimously, it was those things. We should be making games with our players. We should be making sure that everybody's voice is heard on the team and that everyone feels like they were part of this and not just someone who made this little piece. And I think, and that becomes very, very difficult to do when you're a much, much larger studio and you're accomplishing really, ambitious titles with the scope of world that, massive games have. But, that said, Subnautica is an open world survival game with a like a 20-ish hour storyline, really. And that constitutes, in my mind, a pretty big scoped game. And they were able to do that with a fairly small team. Using that sort of bag of tricks that they developed over the years, and quite successfully. The output of that the game's done really well. It's a very, very well put together game. It's a great experience, and innovative and unique, within that sort of genre. And I think a lot of that is attributed to culture. They have a great team, but that team has built that culture at the studio, and they're very, very aware of what they have and protecting that as the studio evolves, I would say. Project teams have a sort of a game director, creative director role, and there's, usually someone who's the sort of senior engineer on the project, and there's an art director on the project. But outside of that, it's really, really flat, and people kind of integrate very organically. Like, I joined the studio sort of as the development director, and we continue to refine what that means based on me getting to understand how they want to work and how they want to grow. But it's everybody's pretty accepting of, like, okay, what do we need to do? What's the most important thing? To go back to Patric's point about goal-driven development, what are we trying to accomplish in 2 months and 3 months and 5 months in the next year? What do we need to do to get there? That's the conversation we tend to have, not sort of like, well, who's in what position and where do we have to put them to be most effective? It's all about what are we trying to get done, and how do we leverage the talent we have to do that, and a lot less about people's title and sort of position they're in within the studio or within a project.
I like what you said about using the public collection functionality of Favro, and I also very much like I saw your Trello board, which is all have one card. We moved to Favro. That's fantastic. So that's great.
I didn't know they had done that. That's funny. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to wrap up a little bit, I kind of want to just go a little bit more into Favro and what are the specific challenges that has been addressed using Favro, just to get a little bit of kind of a case examples here.
Well, one of my favorite ones, I'm actually going to jump backwards on my timeline and experience with the product, is that when I was at Harmonix, we made a game called Drop Mix, which was a collaboration with Hasbro. And it was pretty interesting in that it was a collectible card game that was done on a board. And the cards all had NFC chips in them, and so you would drop cards on the board, and it was like a music generator and card game. And when we were working on the look and the visual idea of the game, we really wanted every card, as in any collectible card game, to be super unique visually. And the way we approached that was we went off and hired all independent concept artists and illustrators to do the cards. So instead of using our internal art team and had a small number of artists making a lot of cards, we basically decided we were going to use a large number of artists across all different styles of art. And we used Favro to track all that, and a lot of it was due somewhat to the flexibility of the product, as you kind of mentioned earlier, but a lot of it was how visual it can be, especially when using art. So we were able to really make every image the front and center point of each Favro card, and to see it go through the pipeline and through art. All the art direction was done on the card. In the Favro card, on the actual art card, and we were able to move, I think we had 50 or 60 contract artists all working on that project, each doing a handful of cards. And so we just had this massive Favro board, with 50 lanes on it, with 300 cards all moving through development on the project. It was pretty awesome. In Unknown Worlds, I think it's still those two pillars that we leverage the most: the accessibility and flexibility of the product in terms of being able to let every team work a little bit differently. And Unknown Worlds develops very organically. And so, for example, if a strike team spins up to solve a problem during a milestone, it's very easy to oh, you know what, we're just going to go and create a board for this and put all the work there. And it doesn't conform to a strict Agile methodology where you would have to configure your project to match the way Agile's supposed to be done by the book. You're basically able to the tool supports breaking the rules in a lot of these nice ways, I think. And the visual aspect, which I mentioned before, at Harmonix, comes into play all the time. I think it's just great to be able to, one of the things that's most important with a distributed team is visibility into the progress that everyone else is making. And when you can have current work surfaced on the card and visible during stand-up, it's just a great way to get the game in front of the team when people can tend to be siloed and working on their own features. And so I think that's another piece of it that's been really useful and helpful for us.
All right, super.
I hope you enjoyed that interview. I certainly did. If you want to elevate yourself as a modern leader and help your teams become even more successful, then check out Favro Academy at favro.com. There you will find podcasts, webinars, articles, all free of charge. Check it out.